In the late morning of April 25, 2015, at exactly 11:56 a.m., the ground in central Nepal convulsed with the force of a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. The epicenter lay near Lamjung, about 77 kilometers northwest of Kathmandu. Within seconds, thousands of structures across the Kathmandu Valley began to give way under the violent shock, spilling concrete, brick, and splintered wood into narrow streets. Dust choked the air as entire residential blocks fell in on themselves, trapping occupants who had no time to reach safety. In central Kathmandu, temples and centuries-old monuments collapsed into piles of masonry, sending dense clouds of pulverized stone down public squares. Markets and residential neighborhoods were hit with equal force. People scrambled into open spaces, but many were overtaken by falling masonry. Witnesses later recovered bodies crushed beneath layers of debris, some burned by electrical fires triggered in the collapse of homes. Throughout the hillsides surrounding the valley, the quake set massive sections of unstable terrain cascading down slopes. Smaller villages were cut off as roadways disappeared beneath tons of rock. Communication lines failed almost immediately, leaving residents in remote areas completely isolated. Reports slowly emerged of entire clusters of houses obliterated by landslides, with whole families buried under the weight of earth and stone. Far above on Mount Everest, the ground movement dislodged a vast wall of ice and snow. Avalanches swept across climbing routes and into base camps, where hundreds of climbers and Nepali guides had gathered. Tents, gear, and people were consumed in seconds by waves of snow and debris. Survivors later described the area as resembling a battlefield, with bodies dragged out from beneath layers of ice while others remained irretrievably entombed. The force of the tremor was not contained to Nepal alone. Vibrations carried into neighboring India and Bangladesh, shaking apartment towers and unsettling rural settlements. In Nepal, however, the density of fragile construction meant sudden and overwhelming devastation. Hospitals filled within hours, their courtyards lined with the injured laid on stretchers and blankets, as staff struggled to cope with the sheer volume. The earthquake's immediate destruction was compounded by frequent aftershocks that rippled through the region in the following days. On May 12th, a powerful 7.3 magnitude tremor added further collapse to already weakened structures. Buildings that had narrowly withstood the initial event finally disintegrated, producing new fatalities among residents and rescue workers alike. By the close of the first day, it was clear the disaster would stand as one of the deadliest in Nepal's modern history. In the hours following the earthquake, Nepal's authorities deployed large numbers of army and police personnel to areas hardest hit. Soldiers moved through the fractured streets of Kathmandu on foot, removing rubble by hand when machinery could not pass. In rural districts, travel was difficult or impossible as landslides and broken bridges severed entire regions from outside contact. Reaching villages often required walking for hours over unstable terrain carrying only minimal supplies. At Kathmandu's international airport, cargo planes carrying aid began to arrive within 2 days. India and China were among the earliest to dispatch relief flights, soon followed by United Nations teams. The small runway and limited ground facilities quickly became congested, with aircraft waiting long hours to unload. Pallets of water, food, and tents accumulated faster than they could be distributed, and trucks were often unable to leave because of damaged roads, fuel shortages, or bureaucratic delays. Urban search and rescue groups worked under precarious conditions. Specialist teams from Nepal and abroad deployed trained dogs and thermal imaging devices to locate survivors beneath collapsed structures. Aftershocks repeatedly interrupted this work, forcing rescuers to retreat from damaged buildings at moments when they were close to reaching trapped individuals. Loose debris, razor-sharp metal, and unstable walls collapsed with little warning, injuring both volunteers and professionals on site. The monsoon season had already set in, and heavy rains worsened the instability of slopes and hardened access routes into rural valleys. Helicopters became the only reliable way to transport supplies to some highland communities, but limited availability meant flights were rationed. Mudslides often covered fresh stretches of road only hours after they had been cleared, negating days of labor. Many survivors in remote areas went without aid for extended periods. Hospitals faced mounting shortages. With thousands wounded, emergency rooms overflowed quickly. Sterile equipment was washed and reused under improvisational measures, while intravenous fluids and antibiotics ran low. Clean drinking water was limited, raising concerns of waterborne disease outbreaks. Makeshift clinics opened under tents, but heat, dust, and sanitation issues complicated treatment. Thousands were forced to recover outside, exposed to both the weather and the risk of infection. Disrupted communication networks created further obstacles. Coordination between foreign relief units, the National Army, and local authorities was frequently inconsistent. Without accurate information, some areas received overlapping deliveries, while others were bypassed entirely. Many displaced residents were directed into open grounds or schoolyards converted into temporary camps. Supplies reached these sites unevenly, and families often waited days with only plastic tarps for shelter and minimal food. Amid these challenges, dedicated efforts continued despite setbacks. Rescuers, soldiers, and volunteers worked around the clock, often with limited rest, attempting to deliver aid and locate survivors in conditions that remained hazardous. The strain of the disaster was visible at every level, from overextended hospitals to the individuals trying to salvage belongings in ruined neighborhoods, underscoring the immense struggle to stabilize the country in the weeks after the quake. The official death toll from the April 25, 2015 earthquake and its aftershocks reached nearly 9,000 people across Nepal. More than 5,000 of these fatalities came from the Kathmandu Valley, where thousands of apartment blocks, shops, and older residential structures failed in seconds. The combination of dense population and fragile construction left entire neighborhoods leveled, with bodies pulled from collapsed masonry and concrete. The losses extended across generations. Hundreds of children died when schools and classrooms crumbled without warning. Families were caught inside homes at midday, with little chance to escape the sudden collapse. In smaller villages, residents were buried under earth and rock, often with entire households lost at once. Barpak, situated near the epicenter, was reported almost completely flattened, leaving only scattered shelters standing among the debris. Beyond the valley and rural settlements, the quake caused one of the deadliest disasters in the history of Mount Everest. A massive avalanche triggered by the shaking swept directly into base camp where climbers, guides, and staff had gathered. Tents, equipment, and supply stores were crushed under ice and snow. 22 people were killed, including both foreign climbers and Nepali Sherpas. Helicopter evacuations removed the injured in difficult conditions, but the avalanche marked the single deadliest day on the mountain up to that time. Accounts from survivors spoke of the ground rising and falling as though in waves, a violent movement that made even standing impossible. Shouts for help were drowned by the constant crash of collapsing stone and concrete. Rescue workers described encountering streets blocked by rubble, where entire families had been buried inside, with survivors searching silently through ruins for lost relatives. The scale of fatalities quickly outstripped the capacity of local facilities. Morgues in Kathmandu overflowed after only days, forcing authorities to line up the deceased in makeshift rows in public areas for identification. the task of confirming names and contacts fell on overwhelmed officials and families, while thousands waited for word about missing loved ones. It was a visible measure of the disaster's reach, with grief and uncertainty extended over nearly every community. In total, victims of the quake included schoolchildren, workers, climbers, and entire rural communities, their losses recorded in the thousands. The suddenness and scope of the destruction made it one of the most lethal natural events in Nepal's history. Its peak marked not only by the shaking of the ground, but by the extensive human cost it left behind. Nepal lies at the meeting point of the Indian and Eurasian plates. The collision of these tectonic boundaries formed the Himalayas and continues to drive seismic activity across the region. Historical records document powerful earthquakes dating back centuries, with the 1934 Bihar-Nepal earthquake destroying much of Kathmandu and claiming thousands of lives. This recurring pattern established the country as one of the world's most at-risk locations for devastating seismic events. By the early 2000s, geologists monitoring the Himalayan fault line warned of an impending earthquake. Measurements showed significant strain had built along the main Himalayan thrust, where locked plates had accumulated pressure for decades. Experts stressed that a release was inevitable and would likely be severe. Government officials were informed of these risks, but efforts to prepare remained limited. Modern construction standards introduced in Nepal emphasized earthquake resistance, yet enforcement was weak. In the Kathmandu Valley, urban growth surged through the 1990s and early 2000s. Families often built homes without engineered plans, relying on informal labor or cheaper materials. Reinforcement with steel and proper foundations was rarely used, leaving dense neighborhoods filled with brittle brick and concrete structures, ill-equipped for seismic shock. Reports released internationally added urgency. In 2013, a United Nations assessment found nearly 80% of Kathmandu's buildings lacked any seismic resilience. It warned that even a moderate earthquake could cause catastrophic damage. Despite this, large-scale retrofitting programs never began. Financial limitations, bureaucratic delays, and lack of political priority left most structures unchanged. Seismologists also emphasized the lack of preparedness infrastructure. Nepal had no functioning national earthquake early warning system in 2015. Communities throughout the country relied on word of mouth, radios, and mobile phones for information, methods that offered no protection against a sudden disaster. This absence meant that when the ground shook, there was no advance notice for schools, hospitals, or households. The convergence of these factors was clear before the disaster struck. A geologically unstable region, coupled with dense urban development and insufficient regulation, left Kathmandu and surrounding districts highly vulnerable. The ignored findings of scientists and international agencies revealed a preparedness gap recognized well before April 25th. When the earthquake occurred, the warnings stood recorded but largely unacted upon, setting the stage for the scale of destruction that followed. The depth of the fault rupture during the April 25th earthquake was only around 15 kilometers below the surface. Its shallow position meant the shaking passed to the ground above with high intensity. Vibrations spread through city blocks and villages at a level of force that deeper quakes often dissipate before reaching the surface. Large numbers of buildings collapsed as a direct result of this amplification. The failures were not equal across all construction. Structures reinforced with steel frames or built to newer codes frequently withstood the shock, while older, unreinforced masonry disintegrated. Investigators noted how widespread use of sun-dried brick, poor mortar, and insufficient foundations contributed to rapid fracture. Many residential complexes and schools embodied these weaknesses, producing a disproportionate share of casualties. In Kathmandu, rapid urbanization throughout the 1990s and 2000s created demand for low-cost housing. Developers and homeowners often circumvented minimum code requirements through ineffective oversight or corrupt approvals. This allowed fragile, multi-story concrete blocks to fill dense neighborhoods. Engineers inspecting debris after the quake identified irregular load distribution, missing reinforcement, and substandard aggregate materials in many collapsed sites. Schools were among the most vulnerable public institutions. Parents and local governments pushed construction quickly to keep pace with swelling student populations. But seismic resistance was seldom enforced. The result was hundreds of classrooms that failed almost instantly. The stigma of tofu-like building quality emerged from this pattern, where walls and pillars offered little structural resistance, folding under the stress of seismic waves. Government choices reinforced these vulnerabilities. International studies and domestic surveys had documented the risks years prior, but retrofitting programs were delayed repeatedly. Officials argued that the costs of upgrading large stocks of housing and public facilities were too high to implement broadly. Instead, economic expansion and new development took precedence over seismic safety standards. Residents were caught without notice, with no time to enter safe zones or shut down critical facilities. The absence of drills, evacuation plans, and community education programs meant the general population did not know how to respond when the shaking began. Urban layout compounded the failures. Overcrowded districts forced buildings close together, turning collapses into chain reactions where falling structures damaged adjacent ones. Narrow lanes left little open space for escape, and people were trapped along congested exits. In rural areas, dispersed settlements suffered in other ways, with homes built into unstable slopes that fractured under landslides. When considered together, the scale of the disaster was not the product of seismic energy alone. The shallow fault depth made the shock severe, but human decisions surrounding housing quality, enforcement, and public safety left millions exposed. Systemic neglect converted a natural hazard into a mass casualty event, marking the gap between what was known in advance and what was left unaddressed. In the weeks after the earthquake, organized rescue continued, even as immediate survival gave way to longer-term recovery. By May 2015, over 22,000 wounded people had been extracted and treated from collapsed sites across the country. International teams from 34 nations worked alongside local forces, pulling survivors from deep rubble, erecting triage stations in open spaces, and stabilizing those flown in from isolated areas. Attention soon shifted to the vast number of people left without housing. More than 600,000 homes were reported destroyed outright, with hundreds of thousands more heavily damaged. Families displaced from urban centers and entire rural districts were funneled into tent encampments, often consisting of little more than tarpaulins stretched across bamboo poles. These sites expanded rapidly, but sanitation and water distribution lagged behind the pace of arrivals. At the same time, emergency pledges of financial support accumulated on an international scale. Governments and aid organizations promised more than $4 billion for recovery. However, bureaucratic disputes and logistical bottlenecks slowed the flow of resources to victims. In many camps, displaced families waited months before receiving replacement materials or permanent shelter kits, leaving large numbers exposed throughout monsoon rains. Investigations into the collapse patterns began almost immediately. Structural engineers and government panels documented shortcuts in construction, including inadequate steel reinforcement and use of substandard mortar. These findings pointed directly to corrupt approval processes and poor oversight that had allowed unsafe buildings to dominate across Kathmandu and surrounding towns. The revelations spread quickly, sharpening public anger toward officials who had failed to enforce codes. Survivors faced not only a lack of shelter, but also long-term trauma. Many members of displaced communities reported chronic fear of re-entering damaged buildings, even those later declared structurally sound. Tent cities grew into semi-permanent settlements as families refused to return, uncertain whether further tremors might occur. Beyond material loss, the psychological impact of repeated shocks contributed to prolonged displacement and disrupted community life. By 2016, declassified reports and independent research highlighted broader systemic failures. Analysts emphasized how non-compliance to seismic safety standards combined with unregulated urban growth had magnified the disaster. These findings were often downplayed in official public briefings, but documentation circulated widely through media and academic outlets. For survivors, the disclosure reinforced long-standing suspicions that the scale of destruction was not purely the result of nature, but the outcome of governance that had placed growth above safety. In the years that followed, Nepal enacted new construction laws designed to reduce the scale of damage in future quakes. Updated building codes mandated seismic-resistant designs and required public facilities, including schools and hospitals, to undergo retrofitting programs. Compliance became a priority in urban planning, with penalties introduced for projects that ignored safety standards. Preparedness measures also expanded at the community level. Training programs and simulations were introduced in schools and workplaces to familiarize residents with evacuation protocols. International seismology groups cited Nepal's experience as a catalyst for strengthening early warning research, influencing regional initiatives throughout South and East Asia. Global institutions reassessed their disaster response strategies. The United Nations and international aid agencies built new frameworks for faster coordination in geographically isolated areas, using Nepal's logistical delays as a case study. These reforms sought to prevent bottlenecks in future operations by streamlining communications and pre-positioning supplies. Memorials now stand in Kathmandu Valley to mark the lives lost, many constructed near collapsed heritage sites. Families of victims use them as places of remembrance, while officials emphasize their role as public reminders of the cost of poor enforcement and planning. The monuments remain as enduring evidence of how oversight failures turned natural hazard into national tragedy. In broader scientific circles, the 2015 Nepal Earthquake entered the record as both a warning and a reference point. It reinforced long-standing knowledge that tectonic strain in the Himalayas cannot be ignored, and it underscored that preparedness determines survival more than magnitude alone. Analysts continue to frame the disaster as preventable in scale, a lasting measure of how risk awareness without enforcement does little to protect lives. For more fascinating horror, hit the like button and subscribe.